Hi, Nick Beach here. This is take 59 and a half. I made a video about 8 months ago called The Opium War and How to Mislead the Reader. And I've got a total of 3 comments, only one of which is my own. So there, take that. Anyway, Sam Holt 8 months ago, asked me a question, which was, do you have any thoughts on the Wikipedia article concerning the first Opium War? Well, anyway, I went fosking briefly to the top of the header, basically, for the article, and I found the following sentence. The British Navy defeated the Chinese using technologically superior ships and weapons. That's right, man. It was so unfair. Well, in terms of technological superiority, there's not much. I mean, you might say, for example, that they had the advantage of steamships, which could aid the sail ships get off of snags, get off of sandbars when they got stuck. Okay, there's that. That's true. And that was useful. And they could tow them upriver against the current. Okay, but, all right. Still, though, I mean, if you're in a river, you've got, fortresses, aiming their cannon down at you. You're basically a sitting ducks. I mean, anybody, trying to fight a war from a river against a land-based force should lose, right? You have a definite disadvantage. Next, you could say, for example, the British had exploding shells. The Chinese cannon used, let's say, lead or metal or iron or whatever, scrap, whatever, and they didn't explode on impact. These exploding shells were byproduct of the French War in 1837 against Mexico, which is called the Pastry War. So, by the way, if somebody says to you that the Opium War had to be fought over opium because it's got the word opium right in the title, then you should ask them, well, dude, I mean, man, what about like the Pastry War? Because like in 1837, which is just 2 years before the Opium War, man, they fought like this war over pastries. Is that what you're telling me, man? Like they're like the French hero said, like, I regret that I have but one life to give for my nation's pastries, man. Is that what he said? Now, while all of that is true, sure. But I mean, to my mind, anyway, I haven't written a book on the subject. I would say that the English did not have a prayer of victory had it not been for the assistance of the local Chinese population. The Chinese population victualled the British Navy. They piloted the Navy through hazards. They shipped dry goods out for the Navy up the Yangtze River. They provided intelligence regarding the dynasty's military movements and readiness. Why? I'll get to that in a second. On the flip side, I would also say that the Chinese are better understood as being the Manchus. Okay, because the dynasty was run by the Manchus and not by the Chinese. The Chinese, were conquered in 1644. The Manchu, who had formed their own dynasty back in 1621 and converted China into a province, one of 4 provinces of their empire. The provinces were Manchuria, Tibet, Mongolia, and China. Beijing was the capital of both Manchuria and of China, the province of China, whereas there were additional capitals. There was a capital of Tibet, and there was also a capital of Mongolia. And so this, of course, created problems because the Manchus are trying to range their forces, which are Chinese, against the British. And the Chinese, of course, don't have a terrible amount of loyalty to the Manchus, as you might imagine, because they were a conquered people. So, in effect, nobody was willing to take a bullet for the dynasty, and hence there was very little bravery shown by Chinese troops, except when they were around their own local towns. When they went beyond them, they had no loyalty at all. Basically, because, China, you had basically, 200 languages spoken? China was an empire. It was a whole mishmash, melange, potpourri, whatever, of different ethnic groups, people speaking different languages and whatever else. It was very kind of ethnically diverse and linguistically diverse for sure. So people from neighboring districts couldn't speak to each other. There was no national language that was spoken really at the time, except amongst the literati. So again, there was very little bravery shown by the Chinese, except when they're defending their home villages, in which case you have the same bravery that you'd expect of any people, basically. Furthermore, most of the recruits were raw, without any training. They couldn't load or aim their cannon with any real effect. This produced all kinds of comedies where a cannon would be fired and there wouldn't be enough gunpowder, and the cannonball would just kind of roll out of the end of the cannon. Or they were notorious for deliberately missing a British craft because they were afraid of being shot back at. They didn't want any return fire because they knew they couldn't defend against it. And of course, there were also cannon which were just fixed in place, where you couldn't swivel them around. Maybe you could tilt them up or down, but you couldn't move them. So you had to kind of wait for a British ship to hopefully move right into the sweet spot before you could attack it, which is of course a crazy way. And again, even then, Chinese often, because they had no loyalty to the dynasty, they were basically hired recruits. They were being paid on the job. I'm talking about like a soldier, like a hired gun, somebody who works for money. In Chinese, you call it a yongbing. What do you call it in English? I see. It's a yongbing, which is a mercenary. I think of the word missionary. Also, Manchu forces seem to be oblivious or completely unaware of something, the standard military maneuver of flanking one's opponent. You outflank them. In other words, you send some troops right down the middle to distract the attention, to gain the attention of the opponent, of your counterpart, and then you actually send the bulk of your troops around the side, sneaking around, and then you can kind of, fusillade them, I think it is, enfilade them. From the side, you can shoot them that way. And unfortunately for the Chinese, the Manchus anyway, they never seemed to learn this. No matter how many times this maneuver was pulled on city after city, it always worked. Oh yeah, and one other thing I forgot to mention. Mao Hai-jian, I have his book here. Yeah, somewhere in this book, it's the English title is The Collapse of the Heavenly Dynasty, a restudy of the Opium War, anyway, by a guy called Mao Hai-jian. He points out here that almost all of the English sailing ships were retired and scrapped, basically, or junked, whatever, at the end of the Opium War, because the British presumed that the Chinese, resistance would be so feeble that they threw their worst ships at them. They did have the steamships, but they also had these just clunkers of ocean-going vessels, which were just on their last legs, sea legs, so to speak. Okay, so the technological superiority is kind of offset by the technological inferiority of using kind of fighting with 18th century ships, trying to fight a 19th century war, combined with the fact that you're fighting land-based troops with a navy, and navies are supposed to always lose. Basically, you're not supposed to have a prayer, and all the rest of it. Okay, so. But take something else in consideration. Only a year before in Afghanistan, a British army of 10,000 was massacred, almost down to the last man by the local Afghani, who were only armed with homemade rifles, scimitars, and their horses. Later in the 1860s, less than 3,000 Maori guerrillas would hold off the English for years in New Zealand, despite the British having an overwhelming technological superiority. They also had more men. They had, howitzers and all the rest of it, but to no avail. The Maoris hid out in the mountains, and they couldn't dislodge them. And they kept running a kind of guerrilla warfare against the British and harassing them for years. Again, with the Afghanis, 10,000 British troops, a British army, basically more or less in one place, and the Afghanis just picked them off. It's just incredibly poor leadership and all the rest of it. So, the idea that the British should have, would have easily defeated the Chinese, actually, if you think about it, it's not a foregone conclusion. The British land forces were the laughing stock of Europe at the time. Also, because Britain, doesn't fight land wars. It's an island nation. They have a good navy, but they have lousy land forces. So they had a lot of kind of factors against them, and yet they still prevailed. And to end this, basically, in closing, I would say, if the war had really been fought between Britain and China, then things might have been different, because there might have been more of a loyalty towards the dynasty if it had been a Chinese dynasty, and if the administration had not been incredibly corrupt as they usually were towards the end of these dynasties. Or even if it was earlier on in the regime, let's say during the Kangxi era, maybe because earlier, for example, actually speaking of which, during the Kangxi era, well, it's actually before that, you have in the mid 1500s, whatever, back in the Ming Dynasty, 1644. What am I thinking of? The Zheng Chenggong defeated the Dutch in Taiwan, and prior to that, I think it was in the 1500s, wasn't it? I think the Ming Dynasty defeated the Portuguese navy. So it's not as if Western troops had this inevitable superiority. They didn't. So anyway, again, because the Manchus installed an apartheid regime, there really was no hope of inspiring loyalty in Chinese troops. I think that's the number one thing, because there was so much resentment amongst the Chinese population towards the Manchus. As I mentioned before, the British got there. They arrived knowing full well they could buy foodstuffs from the Chinese population. They get foodstuffs, they get water, they can get alcohol. They can get pilots. It's easy to find pilots who will guide them into cities or show them what areas to be careful of, how to navigate various currents and all the rest of it. They had so much help from the local population that to my mind, it's easy. It's kind of a 50-50. If the British did not have Chinese help, would they have won the war? Which is again why I would say, when it says the British Navy defeated the Chinese using technologically superior ships and weapons, that being the Wikipedia entry, that the British Navy defeated the Chinese. They didn't defeat the Chinese. They defeated the Manchus, to my mind. Anyway, I hope I said something useful, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.